we'll see. Feel free definitely to ask questions, and that applies to everybody. So I'm going to issue a warning with this talk. You will not, despite the fact that I was saying how ground beetles see the world, this will not help you figure out whether your pet ground beetle needs glasses. More importantly, perhaps, it won't tell you whether ground beetles are agricultural beneficials in our landscape. And that's really a whole nother topic. And I figured I just was not going to be able to cover both of them at the same time. And so I'm glad to, if you have questions, that's fine, and I can try to tell you where we're at. This will have too many graphs. So if you don't like graphs, this is probably, I'll try to explain them, but you'll probably see perhaps more than you want to see. If you've been to one of the ground beetle talks before, some of these slides will be familiar. There's some that I rehash. And if all this morning makes you want to leave, you'll get a full refund. So the invitation, the not read warning sign, this is what the talk is going to be. There's going to be, what does the ground beetle look like? Just a general introduction. A little bit about their ecology and evolution, nothing super in-depth. And then their distribution across habitats at a regional scale. So a little bit, when I say how do ground beetles see the world, I mean, how do they react to this landscape that's out there? And so there's going to be a part about that. And then I'm going to look at two particular examples from our agroecology work. And that's some work we've done looking at how communities change as you go from a forest into a field, and then also beetle banks, which I'll just leave that term up there and I'll explain it when we get to it. And then a little bit about how ground beetle communities change over time and a short wrap-up. So starting with what does a ground beetle look like? So if you are out in the field and you pick up a rock and that little ground beetle runs away, a little black beetle runs away, you probably saw a ground beetle. Not guaranteed, but it's actually a fairly good way of figuring out who they are. There's some other beetles out there that you might see underneath a rock that aren't ground beetles, and that includes, these are the rove beetles. They have these little short, almost like little skirts on them. Those are their wings are all folded up very nicely under that. You've got the click beetles, the ones that do the back flips. Those are not ground beetles. And there's a whole variety of other beetles that you encounter at various times that are not ground beetles. But what is it? This is a ground beetle. So they're kind of many of them are kind of standard issue beetles. They're dark, they have their 6 legs. These are also ground beetles. You see there's a little bit more variation in there. And I'll show you some of the more exotic ones if that's something you can say about ground beetles. They vary in size. So this is a tiny Lembidian. There's the size of a penny. You can see this is one of the ones that you're trying to identify this one in the hand. It's sort of like, well, I think I've got it. They get bigger. This is a larger one. And here's one where this is the size of the penny, and that's the size of the ground beetle. So there's quite a bit of variation in size. So this is just to show you this is their chemical defense. This is a bombardier beetle. It's spraying this scalding liquid, and it can actually aim it.
When attacked, the beetle sets off the explosion, releasing a boiling hot, stinging poison that sends his enemies running. He can even aim it.
So ground beetles have chemical defenses. They're not all quite as ornate as that, but you get to realize when you start working with ground beetles, you can sometimes sort of tell by the smell of the trap that they're in who it is. Some of them are sort of like rancid butter. Some of them are other interesting smells, but anyway. So that's one characteristic too, is their chemical defenses. A little bit about their ecology and evolution, just very briefly. There are, and their diversity. So there are about 40,000, more or less, ground beetles globally in the world. Maybe 2,500 in North America, approaching 600 in New York State, and so far we've documented somewhere around 260 here in Columbia County. So it just gives you a little bit of an idea of what their diversity is like. Here's the first of those daunting graphs. This is an evolutionary tree. You see age here. So this is how many years before the present, 350 million years before present. You've got, this is sort of all the web, all the tree of ground beetle evolution. And the things to find, this is the family of ground beetles over in here. And what you see is that the family of ground beetles has existed for about 180 million years. And indeed, they sort of separated off down here from most of the rest of the beetles about 300 million years ago. And just for comparison, there's a mammalian chart that shows more or less the same thing. Our family's been around for only about 15 to 20 million years. So, you know, the ground beetles have been chugging along since somewhere in here, and we're pretty new on the scene. So they've seen a lot before they saw us. A little bit about their life cycle that differs between the species, but basically, you know, you have eggs, as small insects do. You've got a grub stage that really looks nothing like the adult stage, and then you've got the adult. Usually what happens is they'll lay eggs sort of mid-summer. Those will hatch into the larva here in purple, and then at some point, those will convert into adults. Sometimes the adults overwinter, and you can have some adults that actually will breed twice. I had one big ground beetle that I caught, and I actually kept it for a year, and then I was so impressed by its longevity, I let it go again. A little bit about their diets. So this is just the number of Columbia County ground beetles that are various types of diets. Granivore means it's a seed eater. Omnivore means it'll eat anything, kind of like us. Predatory, of course, means, you know, it eats other insects, other invertebrates, that sort of thing. And what you see is that, you know, you have a fair number of predatory, but also you have the omnivore, and some of our most common ones are actually omnivores. Here's one of the granivorous ones eating some grass seed. But you can bet that that's not the face of a granivore. Yeah, this means business. This one is probably going to be going after caterpillars, things like that. And one thing to remember, and I'm not going to talk any more about them, but this is an example of a ground beetle larva. And look at those chompers. You know, so ground beetle larvae also can be quite predatory. They're a lot harder to study because they're down in the soil, but they're out there doing their thing. Any questions so far? Does that make sense? A little bit about their distribution across habitats regionally. So if you go out and you start snooping for ground beetles, which, aside from getting a sore back, what you find is that they're actually quite specific to their habitats. You find, you know, kind of like, well, perhaps even more specific than birds, because birds can fly around a lot, but you'll find them different types of area, different types of, or parts of the landscape have different communities of ground beetles. So for example, if you're in a wetland of some sort, you tend to get some of these species. If you're in a field, you get something like this. I'll go into this a little bit more detail, but the point is that you actually have, it's not just a uniform community of the same types of ground beetles across the whole landscape. You actually have quite a bit of specificity. And we can look, now you don't have to worry about reading these small details. Don't worry about that. But the point, this is a table of contents for our field guide, which is going to be coming out hopefully next year. And the reason I put this up here is there's about 40, this has changed, somewhere around 40 habitats that we describe in that field guide. And for that, we did field work where we went out. Kyle was with us, and Kyle and I would crawl around on our hands and knees. Kyle was looking for ants, I was looking for ground beetles. And so from that, we've got sort of samples of ground beetles from a lot of different habitats in Columbia County. And, you know, you can be kind of specific. You can even break the forest up into like dry oak forest, northern hardwood forest, floodplain forest, conifer plantation. Each of these are sort of different flavors of forest. And you can do something like this. Now, this is not evolutionary, but this is a way of clustering the different communities. So what it shows you, here you've got the names of the different sorts of habitats. And these diagrams link them up according to the similarity of the ground beetle communities. So for example, the ground beetle communities associated with Calcareous talus, oak hickory, pine forest, young forest are pretty similar. They're different, but they have a lot of similarity amongst each other. Whereas acidic talus slope and pasture, those ground beetle communities are quite different. You'll see, it takes you a long while. They don't actually connect until up here. So the proximity of the connection shows you the relative similarity. These are similar to these, a little bit less similar to these, a little bit less similar to those. You understand how that works? It's sort of a hierarchy. But it lets you get a picture of the tapestry, essentially, of the ground beetles across the landscape. And what you see if you just sort of say, okay, we've got 3 major groups here. You look at those habitats, you sort of got a group of wetland communities, dry and relatively open communities. So you've got fields and stuff in here. And then you've got the forests over here. So this is, at a very gross level, you say, how do the ground beetles see the world? Well, they see it in part splitting it up between wet and dry, forest cover, not forest cover. Those seem to be some of the habitat factors that influence their distribution. Does that make sense so far? That makes sense to people on Zoom? Or the person on Zoom, however many members? So let's look at 4 of those habitats in a little bit more detail. And this is my excuse just to show you ground beetle pictures, mainly. But I'm going to show you, first of all, you have to, before you get to ground beetle pictures, you need to look at a graph again. And this is just showing you the composition of the ground beetle community in plowed ground. And these are various genera of ground beetles. And this is the abundance and the capture. So you'll see that in plowed ground, Harpalus happens to be one of the ground beetle genera. And I actually brought some of the ground beetles with me. So if you want to meet a Harpalus later, you can do that. Elathropus. So you have the Harpalus is a very common group, and then you kind of have that sort of a distribution. Here is actually the most common species we find on farms around here, Harpalus rufipes. And the nice thing about it, in terms of identification, is it's fuzzy. So you can see there's sort of a fuzz on the back there. It's also a European import, so this is not a native ground beetle, but it's our most common agricultural ground beetle. And it's sort of interesting, as a little bit of a side, to think about why are ground beetles fuzzy? And I think they're evolutionarily why. And I think there might be some differing reasons. One of which, so this is how we catch ground beetles. We bury Hawthorne Valley quart yogurt containers in the ground, and then the ground beetles come along and they fall into that. And we don't put anything in them, so these are still alive. But one of the things you notice when you look at this picture is that some of these ground beetles are more conspicuous than other ones. You've got these dark black ones, but you've got some here that are sort of the color of the soil. You see what I'm talking about? These are the ones that are sort of the color of the soil are the rufipes. The reason they're the color of the soil is because all the dust gets stuck in their hairs. So that hairiness might be a way of camouflage. These are just some of the other agricultural ground beetles. I just like this name. Anisodactylus sancticrucis. Okay, I don't know why it got that name. I should have looked it up, but it's just it sort of sticks with one. This is another one of the common ground beetles. Here, inspecting another genus, Pterosticus melanara. This is also from Europe. So again, you're sort of seeing that it's, we've not only brought all the grasses from Europe over for our pastures and hayfields, we've brought over the ground beetles as well, and also for the crop. This is Elathropus, and these are not great pictures, and the reason they're not great pictures is because That beetle is about yay big. It's really tiny. It's essentially the size of a grain of rice, a little bit smaller. So it's very hard to get a good picture of it. This one's slightly bigger, Quadra maculatum. It has 4 spots on it. Another habitat, this is upland meadow. So I've kept the same, this is the same series of the same genera in the same order. And we'll come back to that, but this is sort of what the profile of the upland meadow ground beetle community looks like. And you get things like this one and that one. These are 2 species of labia. You get this one, but look at that neck. Yeah, it's just a really exotic shape. This one is thought perhaps to coexist with ants, have some sort of a relationship with ants. Kyle, we have to figure this one out. Just a beautiful color. It looks that way in the hand. There's no touch up or anything. That's when you see it, that's what it looks like. And I think one of the interesting things that you may have realized is that, just as upland meadows are colorful, their ground beetles are colorful. Now, it doesn't mean you don't sometimes find colorful ground beetles in other places, but in meadows, there's a greater chance you'll find some of the diurnal, the day active species, and they tend to be colorful ones. Here's upland forest, same profile. Now you see Pterosticus is also in the way up here. This is not actually Pterosticus melanarius. It's mostly another species, but here's a fun one. This is Spheroderus. But look how, it's a different shape. It sort of comes to a point. And one of the reasons it's thought that this is useful to it is because it puts its head into snails to eat snail shells, in order to eat snails. So this may be an adaptation, partially to get into snail shells, partially perhaps if you're even attacking a slug, you get all that mucus all over you. You've got this one, which is the same genus as that European one I showed you, but this is native, tends to be really common, sort of a standard morphology. One thing that's fun, if you look at these parts of its leg right here, and you see it's wide, that tells you it's a male. So ground beetles, you can actually, in the field, tell male and female. If you want to amaze your friends, at some point you can do that. Floodplain forests. Now, floodplain forests are really fun. You can sort of get a picture here. Nobody's real common, but there's a lot. There's a diversity here. And ground beetles seem to really like floodplain forests. And when I say floodplain forest here, I mean both the flooded areas and also the stream the banks of the water. And you get things like agonum. Here, does that look like a standard ground beetle? No. I wouldn't have called it a ground beetle, but yeah, it is a ground beetle. This is Omicron. The way you catch these is you go out to a sandy beach and you pour water on the sandy beach and wait for them to pop up. So they like to burrow down into the sand there. A little sort of pill bug shape. This is Brachytis. This is the one, that video that you saw where they were shooting. These are the ones that shoot. And I picked one of these up once and this little puff, and I go, oh yeah, right. And I ended up with a little tiny burn on my finger, so small I didn't feel it, but it was sort of there for a few days that I had that. Very common, or can be quite common, along creeks. Almost never catch them in a farm field or in an upland forest or anything like that. They're quite confined to these stream edge habitats. There's Clenius estivus in this case, another ground beetle along streams. Notice it's also fuzzy. There might be a different reason for why it's fuzzy. And that, I know these are really bad pictures, but it's a hard thing to take a picture of. So what I do when we catch a ground beetle and I want to take a picture sometimes, it's hard because they might want to run away. And so I'll go and I'll put them on a rock in the middle of the stream and take the picture there because I figure, they're not going to want to go in the water. Wrong, they like to go in the water. These ones at least, this one, it was fine. Just walked over to the edge of the rock and went right down into the water. And what you realize is those hairs are now holding air. So potentially it's sort of this little diving bell that lets it, be underwater for a while. And it seemed perfectly happy doing that. There's another one. Loricera. This one's got a mustache. Lots of hairs up front here. And it's thought that those hairs, do you know what snow fleas are? Have any of you seen snow fleas? Little tiny things that jump. Well, there's snow fleas and there's others in that same group, the springtails. This species is thought to eat springtails and use these brushes to sort of gather the to gather the springtails towards its mouth. Okay, so here are those same 4 profiles again, but now they're all side by side so that you can compare them and sort of see which ones are similar or different. And the reason that this sort of a comparison, I should stop. Do you all generally understand what these graphs are showing? Anybody have any questions? Agroecologically, why these are sort of interesting to us is that suppose you want to suppose you have decided, you've been convinced ground beetles are beneficial. We can talk about that, but just suppose. And you want to support them by having other habitat around the farm that supports this community. Well, logically, you think that the habitats that host some of these same ground beetles are going to be the ones that are going to be able to support that. So if you've got if you had a habitat that only had these species over on the right, it wouldn't be able to support the plowed ground habitat. In other words, if you think of a semi-wild habitat as a source, as a fountain of ground beetles, then in order to be effective for supporting the ground beetles of plowed ground, it actually has to have some of those ground beetles already living in it. Does that make sense?
What do you mean supportive? Increase the population?
Yeah, it could be increase the population. It could be just maintain the population. That it could potentially be a source. So if this, for example, if it were the case that whenever a field got plowed, all the ground beetles got killed, it's not the case. But were it the case, then somehow those ground beetles would have to recolonize from somewhere. And if you have a habitat, sort of semi-wild habitat around there that isn't getting plowed but has some of those same ground beetles in it, then it'll be able to carry on that function. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we sort of get to this question, okay, if, as our program is, we're interested in the interaction of wild habitats and agricultural habitats, which of these other habitats may be supporting the ground beetles that occur on plowed ground? That's a question that we have. Does that question make sense? So, what have we learned? This is the blackboard. You'll see this several times. It is indeed possible to identify habitat-specific ground beetle communities. Talked about that, showed you the one. There are greater or lesser amounts of overlap among these communities. So that was, looking at this, yes, you see some of these, there seems to be some overlap here. Maybe the overlap is not quite so great, for example, between plowed ground and floodplain forest, for example. And from an agroecology perspective, it's worth asking which wilder habitats might support ground beetles in crops, assuming you want them. Okay, so now we're going to talk about 2 specific examples of this studying how wild habitat might influence the beetles in the crop fields. And these are 2 examples we've looked at. First of all, we call them forest to field transects. So this is a field where we work. And just suppose this is actually a hay crop, but this could also be a vegetable crop. And the general thought process, to sort of answer your question a little bit, or detail that a little bit more, is that somehow, perhaps in this forest, you have some golden source pool of ground beetles, and there's an aura of diffusing ground beetles that come out here, so that when this field is plowed, those ground beetles can just repopulate that field. That's kind of the theory. Theory is too big a word for something as simple as that, but that's the idea. Oops. That was, right. So, and in this case, we're talking about this is forest here. It's kind of actually a mix between upland and floodplain forest, but basically we're looking at this interaction between forest and plowed ground or crop field. And the way we study that is that we go and we do trapping. We take our yogurt containers and dig our holes and stick them in the ground. And we've done that now for, what is this, 7 years? Yeah, 7 years along these transects where we'll have a point in the woods itself, on the margin of the field, 300 feet in and 600 feet in. So we're trying to, if you picture it, if you sort of had a diffusion of ground beetles, you'd expect to see, well, you see a fair bit here, somewhat fewer here, and even fewer here. Just, they were diffusing out. There's a picture of a pit trap. Looks kind of like a golf hole, but the idea is they come in and they hop into there, and then you can take them out and count them. So what I'm going to show you are a series of graphs that show our results. And here, this is 2 different kinds of ground beetles. And I'm showing you what the captures were. So for example, there's a Nisodactylus sanctuary crucis again. What this shows you that in the woods, this is clear, so we never caught them in the woods. We haven't caught them in the woods. Because these have tan in them, yes, we have caught them at the margin, 300 feet in, 600 feet in. So that's what the tan shows. And then the height of this little rosy bar here is actually the relative abundance. So where did we catch the most sanctuary crucis? At what distance?
It's deeper into the field.
Yeah, 600 feet in. So it actually, we were catching more 600 feet in. Elaphrophis, which is that tiny rice grain of a ground beetle, we actually, if anything, we're catching more in the middle. So this is just, now I'm going to show you for many more species, but do you get that? You sort of get how this graph is structured? Yes? There are many more species. Don't worry about the names, but up across the top in very small print are the names of the different ground beetles. But the point is to look at the patterns. So what you see when you look at this set of ground beetles is you have some species, actually many species, which we only have recorded in the field. Right? None of this is tan. We've never captured them in the woods. Then you've got some that occur in both woods and field, and some that are only in the woods. What's interesting is that actually the most common species, that's where this pink bar is highest, are in this both category. So this is the same graph again. I just took away the image in the back because it's clearer. It's a little bit clearer to see that way. But the fact that you've got these species that occur in both forest and field, this could be a place where you say, indeed, maybe the forest is feeding the field. Yeah, and Alna's shaking her head. And why are you shaking your head?
Well, because there are more of them in the field.
Right, because so you could say, oh, this is possible. But in fact, it looks more likely that's what's happening is these high populations in the field are actually diffusing into the forest. Now we don't actually have the movement patterns in here. Maybe it's easier to catch them in the field. There's some reasons why this might, it's a little bit of a guess, but we certainly don't have clear evidence that there's a great source of these beetles and they're feeding into the fields. Does that make sense? So just sort of to review, we're supposing that wilder habitats may support in-field ground beetle communities. That's our supposition. Looking at the boundary between field and forest, we can see that some ground beetles are found almost exclusively in the forest, some exclusively in the field. However, some are in both habitats, but they actually tend to be most common in the field. And so maybe those field beetles are diffusing into the forest rather than vice versa. In other words, this idea that the wilder habitats are supporting in-field ground beetle communities might be naive. So far, so good. Yeah?
Sorry, are those, there was a wide array of species, but were those mostly the species that pertain to the open meadow habitats? Right, like you had, there were a bunch of species that occurred mostly in upland woods and different areas.
You mean, so you're asking if we,
I'm asking a very clear question.
no, that's okay, I just want to make sure I understand it. You're asking whether, in general, if I looked at these, would they be categorized as forest species or field
Yeah,
species?
right, that's right, because
You know, it's a mix, but certainly the most common one, so this is Harpalus rufipes again, that's the European species. There's Harpalus pennsylvanicus, which is another open field species, as the name implies, pennsylvanicus, it's native. There's Pteristicus melinarius, that European one. So the most common ones in here or in this community in general, are open field ones. Now, the selection here is just all the ones we caught during this study. I think I probably left out a few that we caught once or twice. But this is basically all the ones we caught, either in the forest or in the field, and this is just how it played out. My guess is there might be some more forest species because our trapping effort is actually skewed a bit towards the field. There may be some ones that are only in the forest.
that would be deeper into the woods as opposed to.
Yeah, potentially, or just a lot rarer. Did that answer your question? But feel free to ask it again if I didn't. Okay, so not long to let reality get in the way of a good story, I'll sail on. I'm going to talk about beetle banks. So, how many of you have heard of beetle banks? Well, Claudia's good. Sold.
I have Conrad. This is
Yeah, we
Elizabeth.
just looked at this idea that maybe the forest could supply the field, right? That was what that transect was. But maybe we've got it wrong. Maybe it's naive to think that a forest would be supplying a field, because those are when you think about it, those are very distinct habitats. And you look at their communities and they're relatively distinct. So maybe it's just too big of a difference to expect the forest to supply the field very much. But maybe if you do something more like a meadow, then not only do you just have it alongside, but you actually stick it through. So right here is a 1,000-foot beetle bank that we've installed on this farm. These are plowed fields, potties and stuff. And this is what it looks like. The idea with the beetle bank is it's a double entendre because it's physically a bank. So you actually make a berm through a field, and you plant it with perennial grasses and some wildflowers, which Claudia can talk to you about. But it's also a place where you're banking your beetles. So this is an idea that comes out of England, and the idea is that the field on either side, it gets plowed and all that. You don't plow this, and so it can form a refuge for ground beetles, and then they can periodically, in the spring, flower out of this bank, disperse across the field, and distribute their benefits. And this is some work that's from England that sort of seems to show this. This is distance from a beetle bank. This is just abundance. This is the number of beetles. They're most abundant close to the bank. This is the number of aphids, which supposedly they might be preying on. So the implication is you have a beetle bank, you have a high number of beetles. That translates into a high predation of aphids until you get fairly far away from the beetle bank, and then the beetles are low, the aphids are high. Does that make sense? The idea being that these beetles are eating the aphids, most abundant, close to the bank, and they have an effect on the aphid populations, but eventually you get so far away that you no longer have that sort of aura from the beetle bank. So here, just to graphically present that, here is outlined in yellow is our beetle bank, and the idea is, maybe there's an aura of these benefits that are being distributed by the ground beetles. And as I was saying, the idea is that these beetle banks are a refuge from this, the tillage that can be happening on those fields every year. And here we're sort of, probably that beetle bank is closest to an upland meadow. So we're a little bit saying to something that's similar to an upland meadow, could that maybe feed plowed ground communities? So what did we do? Looks like we shot buckshot on our screen, right? There's the ground beetle. There's the beetle bank. And then each of these indicates a sampling point. Now, our statistician told us they have to be randomly distributed, which makes them really hard to find when the corn is like yay high, and other difficulties. So anyway, but they are actually stratified. In other words, there's the same number at 50, between 0 and 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 150, 150 to 200. There are the same number, and then there's actually a couple extra. There's 6 along the bank itself. And so the question is, do we see any indication of a sort of a concentration of ground beetles here and a diffusion out into the field? And again, this is the same picture I showed you before. We're using our pit traps. There are some issues with pit traps. What are you actually measuring? Are you measuring, well, you're not just measuring density, you're measuring activity, because that's what, the ground beetle is not going to fall in there unless it's running around. There might be things aside from density that's going to affect the number of ground beetles you have in here. That's all I'm going to say about that. So here's this is what I call the club of plowed ground beetles. These are, in other words, this is the community, or this is the group of ground beetles that we found out here, away from the beetle bank. And the question is going to be, the community that we find along the beetle bank itself, is it similar to this? Is it something different? Is there any indication, again, that there's a source along the beetle bank itself that could be supplying this community? So let me show you, this is, you're going to see these graphs. This is showing, this is abundance on this axis. This is distance from the beetle bank on this axis. And I've categorized the ground beetles, all the ground beetles we caught, into 2 groups. What I call the club of ground beetles associated with plowed ground. So that's all the one, this is the ground beetles we caught out in the middle of the field, that community. The abundance of all the ground beetles in that community is shown in blue. This orange line, which you can basically ignore, is just the abundance of those beetles we really only found along the bank and almost never found them out farther away. So this is what it looks like in June, and this is actually kind of what you'd want to see if you were having, if the beetle bank was actually supplying the field, because you're seeing that, look, you find the most of them actually along the beetle bank itself, a little bit less, but still more than at a farther distance. 0 to 50 feet in, and then you get up to 50 to 100, 100. Out here, it sort of seems to level off. So there's a little bit of, yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering, are there any that are strictly like fossorial, or are they all just terrestrial, hanging out like on the ground? Like,
In your,
just like for the pitfall trap.
For the pitfall trap,
like,
there are some that are more fossorial than others, and certainly the larvae are more fossorial. You can tell the fossorial ones too, because they've got these big, kind of look like football players. They got these big shoulders, and they have these wide, almost like a mole, hands or legs. But you do catch them in the pit traps. You probably catch less. It's probably not fair. I think your question is accurate. It's probably not fair to compare relative abundances between the fossorial ones and the non-fossorial ones.
Explain that word.
Sorry?
Could you explain that term, fossorial?
Fossorial, well, just existing mainly in the soil, living mainly in the soil, not on the top of the soil. They almost all, actually, like if you go out in a field in the middle of the day, you don't see ground beetles. You have to dig for them. So they're all fossorial. They're all earth-dwelling to some extent, but some are more than others. But I think it's still valid for any given fossorial species. For that species, it's valid to make comparisons across distances. So this kind of looks good in the sense of whether the beetle banks are supplying the ground beetles. Do you understand why I say this looks good? Or am I just sort of convincing?
No, I don't get that.
So the idea is that you want the beetle bank to be a source of ground beetles, sort of like a sort of picture, ground beetles welling up out of the ground, and that those ground beetles diffuse out into the adjacent field to distribute their benefits. If that's true, then you would expect, for a given group, you'd expect the ground beetles to be most common at the beetle bank, a little bit less common, but still relatively common close by, and then sort of dwindle off as you get far away from the beetle bank. It's sort of like if somebody were cooking here, and that smells really good. You're out here, yeah, I can still smell that. It's, you get out here and it's just, so this sort of a pattern helps you understand where the source of ground beetles might be. Does that make sense? So this doesn't look bad. This is with June. July, they go, there's June, there's July. Well, maybe what's happened is that now they've established themselves in here, they're taking hold in the meadow. And there's September, least abundant at the beetle bank itself, most abundant out here. Again, it could, if you could make a theory that, they've diffused out, they're breeding out here, they slowly get more and more common, until they get wiped out by plowing again. Nice story, probably doesn't hold. I'll show you, lay another graph on top of this. Are you ready? If you're not, I understand. I sympathize. Ignore the rest of this graph for a second. This is the community of ground beetles that make up this club. In other words, in June, the most common ground beetle in this real ground beetle community is Parasiticus molinarius. So a lot of this pattern, basically all of this pattern is due to the occurrence of one species, which does indeed follow this. Once you get into July, this pattern, here's molinarius, it's just that tiny little bit of brown up there. Most of the field ground beetle community at this time is Harpalus rufipes, and that's true here again. So what seems to happen is that pattern you see in June is due to Parasiticus molinarius. This pattern in July and September is due to Harpalus rufipes that shows no indication of using the beetle bank as a source. So the answer to the question, is the beetle bank a source for ground beetles, is maybe, or for some species, perhaps. Maybe for Parasiticus molinarius, who shows this distribution, could be. Harpalus rufipes, it would be hard to make the case, because indeed they are most common all the time that you catch them. They're the most common actually out in the middle of the field. This is the Parasiticus molinarius thing. What secrets do I know? So, what is this really using the beetle bank as a source? I don't know. That was the data. You're the first. This is the world premiere. I'm sure you feel very honored about that. But this is the first time that those are the data from this past year, and that's the first time they've been out. Yes.
So, do you know for sure that the plowing disrupts them as much as your research is assuming?
I don't think it does. I think that's the key, is that no, I don't think it does. I think you have this group of ground beetles, Harpalus rufipes, who do just dandy with plowing, and as you'll see.
You can one and they figure out how to live.
For whatever reason, they're fine at it. So I think that the truth of the matter is, you've got this community of plowed ground beetles that many of the most common ones came over from Europe, where they had been plowed for eons, and they actually are highly adapted to that situation. Now, all the work we've done has been on organic farms, so I don't, if you start throwing in pesticides into this, that might be a completely different picture. And I just wanted to say, I'm not going to go into these data in detail. We actually have information from earlier in the season. So we put up, these are little, they're called emergence traps. You seal them around the edges. The ground beetles or whatever else that's in here over winter comes up and gets captured. And it's a way of saying, like our beetle bank's really serving as a winter refuge for some of these creatures. What happens when you look at these data is it's a completely another set of ground beetles. None of the ones that we find later on in the fields. I'm not going to talk about those data anymore at the moment. But anyway, just to let you know, we did that. So what have we learned? Some ground beetles seem to largely restrict themselves to the beetle bank. Some seem to favor plowed fields. At least one common species, the Pteristicus melanarius, does seem to occur in both beetle bank and field, and its distribution suggests that maybe those beetle banks play a role in its demography. So there's room to dig a bit deeper. One of the questions is going to be, so what with Pteristicus melanarius? Yeah, go ahead.
So the main species that you're finding in the cloud fields that you said were adapted because of their standard is the
Harpalus rufipes. Harpalus rufipes.
Harpalus. Okay.
Yeah.
And so they're the non-native ones. Do you have any data on the interaction between those non-native species and the native species, and like what those interactions are? Like perhaps they're predating on like the smaller rice-sized ones.
Well, one thing is, the plowed fields is not a native wild habitat to North America. So it's not that there was sort of like a plowed field native species community that existed for eons here, because you had Native Americans, you had some plowed fields, but not to the extent that you do now. I don't know how it has shaken out, but I think now it seems to be more or less a fixed group of species that obviously can interact with each other. And I say that because this same group of species repeats itself in the Midwest, repeats itself in Pennsylvania and Maryland. And in fact, Pteristicus melanarius and Harpalus rufipes occur in Europe in the same abundances. And I would if there is some species that's being excluded, it probably has already been excluded, would be my guess, because these species are not recent introductions. They probably came over in ballast in boats in the 1700s, 1800s, maybe in plant soil. They've been around for quite a while. So, and people who have looked at these communities over the years, there doesn't seem to be obvious evolution, obvious change happening in these communities over the recent, unlike bees, where you see decline, you can see there's been recent declines in some species. From what little bit I know about the agricultural field ones, I don't know that there's much indication that there's been recent change in that community. So it's a good question. I don't have a concrete answer, but I don't know that it's not clear.
There's not that much competition because the native species aren't using cloud fields the way that they are.
And the few that do, are obviously very good at it and can coexist with these other ones which have been around for a long time. That's sort of a gut feeling. I can't say I can show you data for that. Plowing right along. It'll be good to continue. Anything else?
Actually, Conrad, we have a question.
Yeah.
Someone asked, where do ground beetles pupate and where they overwinter?
Yeah, that's a hard. So the question was, where do ground beetles pupate and where do they overwinter? Probably largely in the same areas where we're finding the adults, but they're in the ground. So the pupa, which you don't find very often, are definitely down in the soil. The idea of planting perennial grasses along a beetle bank is that it's thought that that's where they actually will go and nest. So there's probably, I would say it's probably most of the time it's in the same habitat, but probably particular places in those habitats. And they overwinter, some of the adults overwinter, they just hibernate, and I think they're hibernating down in cracks in the soil. And they're obviously able to freeze, because I don't think that, unless they're able to go below the frost line. And the eggs, as far as I know, are distributed in the soil. The pupa would be there too. Probably they're overwintering as adults or larvae are probably the two stages. And those larvae also would be down in the ground. And you do catch the larvae, just not as often. Is there anything else on? Thanks for the question. All right, we're getting near the end. So it's a little bit on how ground beetle communities change over time. We've talked about how ground beetle communities change across the landscape. But what happens if you stay in one place and you change the habitat on top of them? So we've done that. Wasn't quite the reason we did this experiment, but we've done it anyway. So if you look at this, this is a field where we've done some work at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub. And if you just look at these places that I've outlined in yellow, this is 2016, it's a crop field. Here's 2021, you'll notice, oh, these funny little rectangles popped up within these yellow areas. And those are our native meadow trials. Those are half-acre plots that have been seeded. One is in wildflowers, one is grasses, one's a control, and that's just repeated. So these are areas, and that's a whole nother talk. So all I'm going to say is that these patches went from being in crop field in 2016 to going into these unplowed, seeded areas in 2017. And so the question is, that's what it looked like when it was just before, just as it was getting prepared. This is 2017. And then this year, standing in the same place, you can actually see that tree there and that hill there? There's the tree, there's the hill. But, that's a pretty big change. And it's not just that there's a beauty strip. This goes back. The whole thing looks like this. So the question is, if you have this huge change, what does that mean for the ground beetle community? Okay, one of these again. Oh no. So these are 5 different years where we have data. This is the percent composition of the ground beetle community. So in 2017, of all the ground beetles we caught, 100%, what does that look like? It looks like about 50% were this brown species, which is Harpalus rufipes. So don't worry about who the species are, but each color represents a different species. And it shows you how the composition of the ground beetle community changed across the years. Does that make sense? So you sort of, forget about these little names down here and just look, the question being, so how has the pattern changed? Do you have any comments? How would you describe this?
Well, it's the most diverse in 2019. So what?
Sorry?
It looked the most diverse in 2019. So
Right.
I was wondering, I guess what the wildflower meadow looked like in 2019.
Yeah, I mean, Claudia can tell you, there wasn't, I'll tell you that there was no sort of huge event here. It's been evolving over time. So I don't know, and this pattern, I should say, I'm just showing you here for the wildflowers. I've looked at this also for the grasses and for the control, and it's the same pattern. 2019 seems to be quite diverse. And one possibility would be it's sort of a intermediate period where you're not quite in the homogeneity of a plowed field, but yet you still have some of that. I don't know. I agree with your point. It's more diverse, I don't know why. Any other patterns you might say?
Is there any predatory behavior going on between them, among them?
I don't know.
What about the weather?
The weather would probably have some effect. That it could be wet or dry. Might have some. We don't have data on that. That could be having some effect. But picture this is essentially bare ground here, and this is that very thick vegetation. I mean, it sort of surprised me in some ways, because when you look at this, it almost looks, you can almost say, well, yeah, they're not the same, but, you know, Harpalus rufipes is most common here and here. You have some of the same colors. You know, 2021 almost looks, it's certainly not identical to 2017, but it looks more like 2017 than 2019 does. But there's a catch in here. This is just showing you the percent of composition, right? If I show you the actual captures, it goes like that. So this is the abundance. So each of these bars, you know, is still the same. In other words, this is 100% of the captures. That's that bar, but it's just much smaller because we were catching many fewer ground beetles in 2021. So then you have this huge change in the number of ground beetles. And if you look at this, I think this is the last graph. If you can breathe deeply, this is your last graph. This is sort of showing you the same data in a way. The black line here is the average number of ground beetles we're catching. So you see 2017, we were averaging like 32. Down you get to you get to this past year and we're around 5. A huge drop in the number of ground beetles. Red is the number of ants. So ants zoom up, ground beetles go down. I don't have a explicit answer to this, but what do you think? I have some ideas why this might be happening, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Predatory,
Okay, who on who?
the ants,
The ants eating the ground beetles?
or affecting their livelihood in terms of what they need.
Yeah, they could be eating ground beetle eggs, for example. It's possible that there's a direct interaction between the two of them. Yep, I agree, that's a possibility. What else might be possible?
Maybe the ground beetles need that like continual loosening of the soil and be able to burrow into it in order for its
And yeah, so and where was that loosening coming from? And what happened to the plowing in this? The plowing stopped. So this, and what do you think? How do you think ants react to plowing?
Sorry, I'm
How do you
having
think
trouble
ants?
hearing.
How do you think ants react to plowing? So yeah, you're saying, well, maybe the ground beetles are missing the plowing.
Plowing, but the ants are happy as clams.
Right, because I mean, if you think about it, you know, and Kyle can correct me here, but if you have ant nests, you know, you're constructing a nest, and that's getting plowed, it's kind of hard to maintain your lifestyle. Whereas, you know, you get out here, I tell you, this past year, trying to dig those pit traps and not encounter an ant nest, it was really difficult. I mean, here, I was not catching any ants at all. I was stunned. I was like, what, there's no ants here. Same place, passage of years, huge number of ants, many fewer ground beetles. I can well imagine it's not an either or. I think, Rafe, you might be right. You know, there may be some direct interactions in here. And yet, it may be that the plowing initiates this, and once the ants get in here, they just, contribute to the decline of the ground beetles. Don't know. But if you think about the fact that you're creating, these wildflower meadows were put in as beneficial habitat, well, it ain't working very well for these ground beetles.
Well, how do these beetles and ants affect the actual growth in the land?
Growth of the crops?
Yeah, or the weeds, or the flowers.
Right. That was the question I wasn't talking about tonight. I think it's an excellent question because, we talk about ground beetles as being beneficial. And so who said they're beneficial? Because if we remember going back, I showed you that quite a few ground beetles are omnivores. And what that means is a ground beetle like Harpalus rufipes, maybe at some point, sometimes, it's controlling weed seeds. They're beneficial. You bring it into a strawberry field and it's eating strawberry seeds. It's a pest. So, even within a single species, to just stick a label on it is very difficult. So I don't have those results. We sent them off. What we've started to do is we actually collect ground beetle regurgitate, which is a polite way of saying vomit, and send that away for genetic analysis to understand the question that you're asking. What are these ground beetles, what are they doing? Are they eating crops? Are they eating something that's unrelated to the survival of the crops or the plants? Are they controlling, might they be eating a lot of weed seeds? We won't necessarily know whether they're actually controlling those weeds or controlling those pests, but if we realize that a lot of them are eating that pest or eating that weed, then at least there's the possibility. If they're not eating any of the weeds and any of the pests, then it's sort of like, well, they're important for biodiversity, but in terms of agroecology, the agronomic results may not be very big. So, yeah, that's kind of a key question.
But do these insects actually affect the health of the soil itself?
I don't know.
Because there's so much else going on in the soil, right?
There's a whole lot going on in the soil. We're hoping, so in these same plots where these data come from, we have these other collaborators at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub. So there's a woman, Carmen Greenroad from SUNY Cobleskill, who's looking at the soil macroinvertebrates. That's like the nematodes and the mites and the springtails in the soil. There's another researcher looking at the microbes, the bacteria, the fungi. So ideally, what we hope to be able to put together at the end is a little bit to try to get to that question. Is there any indication, for example, that where you've got lots of Harpalus rufipes, you've got very few, a certain type of fungi? I'm just completely making that up. But starting to try to look for, are there any correlations that would suggest interactions? And then once you've sort of identified those potential interactions, then one will want to dive in and actually see, is there any indication that that's really happening? So I don't know, but I think it's an excellent question, and I hope we're able to learn a little bit more. Yeah.
Did you start this work because you had the notion that they must be beneficial or they were beneficial? What's that whole, I know it's not what you want to talk about.
No, I mean, I don't mind.
Why are you studying
Yeah,
them?
that's exactly.
The meaning of life.
Your life is this work.
Yeah, no, so.
I know you like them, but.
Right, that's the bottom line is I like these. Don't be quiet. No, the idea with this work was to evaluate techniques that are being suggested by and funded by USDA and RCS as being beneficial. So it's a little bit the question, are those resources being put to the best use? And starting it out, I didn't know, and I still would say I don't know. But that was kind of all right, let's try to understand whether what's being proposed is actually happening. And I think one of the reasons that question makes sense is that, as I alluded to with the beetle bank, a lot of these techniques come from other landscapes. They don't come from this landscape. And you could imagine that if you're installing wildflowers in the middle of South Dakota through cornfields and soybean fields, the impact of those beetle banks or that wildflowers might be a lot bigger than when you install it around here, where you've already got quite a few, you've already got quite a diverse landscape. It doesn't mean it hurts by any means, but maybe the effect won't be as great because you've already got, in some ways, you already got it so good. I don't know if that's happening or not, but the possibility that it might be happening is kind of a reason to take some of these techniques that originated in other landscapes and ask, do they seem to be working here?
This is only relevant in organic landscape, right?
Not necessarily. I mean, it depends on how intensively pesticides are being used. I mean, for something like, now, if you're talking about weed seed and pest control, largely yes, you're right. But even if there are ways that the beetles are helping reduce weeds so you don't have to spray as much herbicide, for example, maybe that's good. It becomes more like with bees, because even if you're conventional, you still need the bees to fertilize. So and the idea when we created this beneficial habitat was not specifically to just study the ground beetles. It was definitely to also study the bees, the wasps, the Kenny studies, sort of look at the whole community of beneficials, and also just biodiversity. So yes, it'll be different in a conventional landscape. And if you're spraying a lot, and this is just a final thought that we've looked at, the one place where we've looked at both conventional and organic systems is in orchards a little bit. And the question there was, well, what role does the edge of the orchard play to the ecology of the orchard? And we looked at transects out from the edges into the orchards. We looked at damage on the trees, the abundance of beneficials. And what seemed to happen is that around the edges of an organic orchard, you actually seem to get some positive, perhaps, benefits, some evidence that there was some beneficial activity kind of emanating from that forest. And these are orchards where you haven't had spraying. In a conventional orchard, they don't care. They're taking care of those beneficial effects like pest control through spraying. So edges, the only thing that they are is a source of pests. So you kind of realize that how you view that wild habitat may flip depending on the system that you're working in, if that makes sense.
But I guess the question about all of this is how to make all these things beneficial to growing and creating food. There's nothing that's come forward.
Nothing that has come forward. Well, you mean in this talk?
Well, in the whole thinking process, the way you're describing.
Well, I mean, I think we don't know. We have not. One is we don't yet know what the ground beetles are doing. So I'm not going to say that they're not having a beneficial effect. I just don't know. I don't have any evidence that I could share with you one way or the other. We're trying to look into it.
But you started with the fact that this was being used in other countries,
right,
for a positive reason for a certain effect, and you were trying to see if that was real.
Right. And I don't know whether it is yet. And I think there's, for example, I'm indicating over to Kenny here, because he's studying the parasitoid wasps, which are and he will be talking on those, about those in February, right? February. So they might be having a beneficial effect. And actually people, organic farmers buy in parasitoid wasps in order to control pests. So there are relationships that are known to be interactions. And the question then becomes, well, if you create these areas of wild or semi-wild habitat, are you benefiting those parasitoid wasps that might be helping to control pests? And I don't have an answer to that, but that's another. So just because I'm being a little bit wishy-washy about ground beetles doesn't mean that there aren't other beneficials that are benefiting from this management. And also the bees we've not talked about either.
Well, it's just the exploration, if I understand.
Yeah, am I answering your question? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Clearly.
Is there anything? That's actually this pattern. That's just a pretty picture of a ground beetle. And then, we've learned that beneficial habitats may not benefit everybody, at least in the short term. More than responding to above ground vegetation, ground beetles may respond to soil management. Ants seem to think that lack of pollen is dandy. And then I just wrapped up, understanding ground beetles in the farmscape is a bit like trying to follow a checker game where the colors shift and the checkerboard is fluid. So, you realize that, again, because each of these species can play a different role, the same species play a different role in a different place, and because the landscape changes, it's not constant. There's a lot of complexity built into this. And then overall, this is the final wrap-up. Ground beetles are beautiful, but largely unseen. I don't know how many of you had been thinking about ground beetles before you came tonight. Maybe some of you were. and they're sensitive to the nuances in our landscape, and following them can help us understand ecological patterning around us and the impact of our actions. So, another reason that we've gone into this is biodiversity conservation, regardless of whether there's a benefit to agriculture. Understanding how these organisms interact with their landscape so that you can keep an eye out for them and the good of them is an important part of our work. Cropland seems to support a somewhat distinct community of ground beetles, largely dominated by European, what I'm calling agrophilic, farm-liking species. It's not clear how relevant semi-wild habitats are to the persistence of our cropland ground beetles. As I said, it seems like there may be a rather intact community of plowed ground beetles that don't necessarily need the semi-wild habitat. Differences that look dramatic to us, such as those plantings that we did, through the eyes of the ground beetle may not be as significant as perhaps something like the cessation of plowing. So we tend to go with what we see and we think, oh, the vegetation has changed hugely. Well, maybe it's actually something that's happened to the soil that's more important. And then the last conclusion is one can make an awful lot of graphs of ground beetles. So if any of you have any questions or comments, yeah.
So Elizabeth Marks is on Zoom, and I think she's gonna unmute for a second to explain her question.
Okay.
Hi, Conrad. How's it
Oh,
going?
I have to unmute on mine.
Oh,
Well, it was playing the audio before, so I think your speaker is on, just your normal.
can you hear me
Unmuted.
okay?
Yeah, I think it was on because it was playing the video earlier.
Can everybody hear me?
I've got it up all the way.
Okay, so you can hear me in Zoom. Great.
Maybe you can relay it.
Wait, I think I can hear it.
So I have to admit I have more questions than answers.
Let's see, maybe if I go into Zoom, maybe I have to wait.
I think we can do that.
Okay.
Hold on, Elizabeth.
Okay.
This is beyond our technical abilities. Let's see here.
Okay, I can listen, and I can relay. Okay, go ahead.
So I have to admit I have more questions, Conrad, from your presentation. It kind of sounds like from you that beetle banks are not something that we should be promoting in NRCS. So I should tell everybody I'm a biologist with NRCS. And we have been planning beetle banks, and this is based on recommendations from the Xerces Society, but it sounds like, in your opinion, it's not beneficial.
Now is it off? Okay, I was trying to listen, hoping I could hear. So my brief answer was that I think we don't have strong evidence that they're valuable yet, but we have very little. We only have 1 year of data. So as I said, this was the world premiere, and 1 year of data in the insect world is very little because year to year can be influenced a lot by that. There's a little bit of indication with Pteristicus melanarius that there might be a benefit. So I think I wouldn't say no, but I wouldn't say we have strong proof. And Claudia wants to say so.
But that's considering only the impact of beetle bank on ground beetles.
Right.
There are other things happening, like they're full of birds at this time of the year, and they're full of butterflies and bees earlier in the summer. And so I think definitely in terms of biodiversity, they're doing something on the farm. But if they're benefiting the crops next door, who knows?
Did that pick up? Okay.
Also, at the end of your graph where you showed the amount of beetles you caught, there were obviously hardly any. What would you do at that point?
What would you do with what goal? With what goal?
Would you bring back more beetles?
If your goal was to bring back more of those cropland ground beetles,
Right.
you'd plow probably. Now I think there are reasons why you don't want to do that. I mean, because if you plowed those wildflowers, you get rid of all, as Claudia was saying, you get rid of the habitat for the bees, for the wasps, for the butterflies. It just happens that ground beetles seem to be the community of ground beetles that we have seems to do most of them seem to do relatively well with plowing. And so it's just that one size doesn't fit all. And so you can't necessarily expect that you're going to be able to benefit the bees and the wasps and the butterflies and the ground beetles. Now, if you're talking from a biodiversity perspective, what I'm going to be curious to see is whether we don't start getting some of the sort of rarer ground beetle species showing up in these plots, which will be neat from a biodiversity conservation perspective. But those rarer ground beetles probably are not going to be doing something for the crop. So it depends on if your goal is just strictly the number of ground beetles, then maybe I'd say plow. If your interest is native ground beetle diversity, irregardless of what they do for the crops, I'd say stick with it a while and let's see what happens. Yeah, Ellen.
Did you say that there was funding for this because the big agencies are promoting it? I didn't understand that.
So you can get, Elizabeth Marks can correct me, but basically, if you do a pollinator plan, at least this is the way it worked a few years ago when we did it. If you do a pollinator plan through Xerces NRCS, then you can get cost share, which isn't funding for everything, but it's funding for part of it, cost share to do some of the techniques that are included in that pollinator plan. That pollinator plan, in our case, when we did it here in Hawthorne Valley, included beetle banks and some wildflower areas.
But it wasn't specifically from the funder's point of view. It wasn't about the ground beetle research that you were doing. It was about pollinators generally.
Well, it was beneficials generally. I mean, they said pollinators, but the idea, I mean, you put in a beetle bank. It's called a beetle bank because it's kind of the idea or the origination of it was
right. But really, as Claudia
said, it could be it's a wildflower strip.
Right.
If now the complication there, as Claudia has realized, is that you, according to the instructions for planting a beetle bank properly, you want to have perennial clump grasses, like little blue stem or big blue stem, because it's thought that that's where the bunch grass, I should say, it's thought that's where the ground beetles like to pass their winter and where they like to nest. If you start planting wildflowers in there, then those wildflowers can sometimes shade out or sort of exclude your perennial grasses. So it may be difficult to get that balance, or you might have to be a little bit more intentional. Maybe you've got to have so many feet of perennial grass and then so many feet of wildflower and so many feet, because you know, if they're fighting it out together, maybe the grasses tend to lose out for a while. Although what our other research has shown is once those grasses get established, well, they're not letting anybody in. But you have to get to that point of being established. Any other questions? Yeah.
What is your management scheme been like in those grasses and wildflower areas? Like, are you burning? Are you mowing every year? Are you mowing months?
I mean, I'll let Claudia answer that because she's been more in touch in the.
So with the native meadow trials, we've basically, during the establishment year, we've mowed high 3 times during the summer, so that the seeded plants could start growing in underneath, but the weeds that were still coming in pretty strong wouldn't go to seed. And then the following 2 years, we didn't do anything because the seeded plants had established really well and were doing well. And then we were starting to see problems with weed plants coming in. And so now we're mowing once a year, very late in the winter, like as soon as the machines can go back in, like in March. And that's to keep the woody plants down.
Did that come through, Josie, or should I repeat it? Came through okay? Okay.
Are you doing this, just straight mixes, or do you have like things that are like, oh, just a straight strip of native grasses, or is it all those mixed?
Well, so in the native meadow trials, we have those half-acre plots that are all mixed. Or, yeah.
Yeah.
Elizabeth this week. What's that?
Not here anymore.
She's not in the meeting anymore? Oh. Okay.
So is anybody, any other questions or comments, either from the Zoom world or from the real world? Well, thanks very much for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Maybe it changed a little bit how you think about ground beetles.
Look forward to those diet analysis.
Oh, I am too. They're now at the lab, and you know, actually the only ones we sent out this year were Harpless Rufipes, but we sent them out because we only started this after the Pterostichus melanarius had largely disappeared from the scene. But we sent in regurgitate from various habitats to try to see, you know, maybe they're doing something different when they're in corn versus in the wildflower meadows versus in the soy, to try to get, you know, a better idea of their role in different.
What would be the best result?
Whatever it is. No, and I just mean that I really don't have, I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on.
But do you have some expectations?
I really don't. I don't, because
True scientists.
no, because those ground beetles are omnivores. The Harpless Rufipes is omnivore, and you know, it could be doing a variety of different things. So there has been some, you know, work done on other farms, but in other situations, other landscapes. So I don't know what to expect.
You've seen those other studies?
Yeah, they exist. Yeah, and actually, the technique we're using is a technique from Europe, where they also have Harpless Rufipes, and we're going to compare our results to theirs. And unfortunately, I can't offhand say what their results are. I have to look at them again. At the same, we sent in the ground beetle regurgitate. We also sent in, we're going to see if we can do bird droppings, because birds can play a huge role on farms, both as damage to crops, but also as control of beneficials. And from another farm, we sent in some bat droppings, because they're also out there flying over the fields. And so this year is just sort of, in part, just a pilot to see if the technique, can we get any useful information out of these? And if we can, then we'll think a little bit more carefully about how we what's happened.
how do you collect regurgitate?
I was wondering if somebody was going to ask that. Kyle knows because he's a partner in crime. So I should preface it by saying that the alternative is to send in the whole ground beetle and get it ground up. Which, even though Rufipes is really common, I don't feel very good about that. So the regurgitate method is you put some hot water in a teacup. I mean, you get the water to boil and you put it in a teacup. You put the beetle in a plastic tube and you dip it quickly. And you obviously causing it a little bit of distress, but it's like when you pick up, it's most dramatic when you pick up a grasshopper and you get all that spit on you. That's regurgitate.
Yeah.
So they're upset and they're throwing up. And then what seems, at least in the short term, when you take them out of there, you let them go, you put them back in their little container, and they just start running around again. So, it seems to be, and then you can just let them go and they run away. Now, they don't have an empty stomach. I won't say that it's, I won't say it's perfect, but it certainly seems like a technique that's a little bit more humane. I mean, not that we trap insects and kill them for other things when we can't identify them because they're so small. So I'm not trying to be perfect here, but just when we can, it's nice to have those sorts of techniques.
So how many do you need to get?
In order to get
A sample?
Well, I mean, so out of 10, if I get 10 ground beetles, I'll usually get regurgitate from like maybe 7 or 8 of them. Now, the number of samples that you need in order to sort of describe what they're doing, I think we're going to have to see what the variation is, amongst them. So I think that's going to definitely need more than 7. But we'll have to, once we get some initial idea of the results, then we'll have to try to figure out what sample size we need.
Do you know if the regurgitation is just like a reaction? I feel like I don't see it.
I mean,
Right, defensive or just like reactive?
I think it might be more reactive because I think the defensive, they more have this chemical, these other glands that.
Right, you're talking about it.
Right, and they sometimes throw up when you're holding them, but not all that often. They're not as much as grasshoppers do. So my tendency is to think it's more distress.
Someone asked if anybody monitors ladybugs in beetle banks, or if you have found them.
Does anybody monitor ladybugs, lady beetles? We are collecting. Wait, I should go back a step. In the beetle bank, we have only been doing pit trapping so far, and that's just because of person power. In our wildflower plantings, as Kenny and Kyle well know, we get whatever comes into a sweep net, whatever comes into our malaise trap, and there we definitely are counting lady beetles and trying to keep track of them. It might be appropriate to do more of that trapping in beetle banks, and it's really just a matter of person power, and we'll have to see how we plan our future work. Anything else online? All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.